Welcome to the first programme in BookChat. I'm Adrian and I'm going to bring you regular interviews with writers. Today we're going to see Kate Hardy, an English writer who lives here in France. However, today is the last day of freedom before the second coronavirus lockdown, so I think future programmes will be on Skype. But today we can speak to Kate in her lovely house here in Touraine, where she lives with Mark and her two dogs. Here we are on Magira. This is Kate A. Hardy, the author of Londonia, published in 2020, this year, by Tartarus Press in the UK. And here is Kate holding her book, which is a riveting work of fiction, over 400 pages long, beautifully produced, I must say, the physical book itself, and it's also available as an e-book.
I'll show the cover as well.
And it's got a beautiful painting, is it, on the cover of London, looking very Dickensian, because as I've mentioned before in my introduction, Londonia is a dystopian novel set in London in 2070, after what we learn is the final curtain, some kind of war, a Third World War, and the collapse of technological civilization, which throws us back to a kind of, it throws us forward to a futuristic London, but also back to an atavistic London, which has elements of medieval society with bartering and so forth, but also Dickensian London and maybe echoes of other dystopian fictions. I'm thinking in particular of H.G. Wells' Time Machine, because in that book we have a decadent race of Eloys and a working class subterranean race of Morlocks who...
Never actually read this.
You haven't read it, but it's a common trope, and you find it in a lot of dystopian fiction, that the decadent jeunesse dorée, their lives are supported by myrmidons who toil underground or elsewhere. And we have that in your book as well, because Londonia, in the middle of futuristic London, there is the cincture, a walled area where the rich and decadent and fanciful live, while the strugglers live outside. I've said enough. Where did the idea of this novel come from?
It just really appeared in my head while I was swimming. This often happens. Swimming and walking are usually times when I have an inspiration, and I just got out of the water and I thought, woman living in a church with a horse in late this century, 2072, and that's how it started. Yeah. So I got out and I just started writing. I didn't really have any sort of plan particularly, but I just had lots and lots of images. A lot of my work tends to be very filmic. I studied film and photography a long time ago, and I don't usually plan things out as such with a sort of plan. I just started writing, and it sort of flowed quite well. And many rewrites on, we have the final book.
I must say it's very richly imagined. From the very first page, from the word go, you're plunged into a world that you really believe exists, and lots of questions arise, like what has happened, of course, what has happened to destroy the society we know and replace it with this backward, struggling society, but also, for example, why do people speak a slang that mixes in a lot of French words?
Well, that's partly because I live in France, so I'm very...
That's no excuse.
Severe flooding, massive flooding, and lots of migration. London is said to be, anyway, now, I think it's the 6th French city. So there's already a vast number of French people there who seem to absolutely love being there. Let's hope they don't get kicked out in next year. So I was basing it on that. It's the premise of the story is quite open to imagination, because I think it's a very difficult thing to for an author to totally say that one particular thing happened. I think it could be a lot of reasons, and we're in the middle of something at the moment, obviously, which could possibly lead to certain breakdown in society. So I've left it quite open, but the final curtain is the point where this, well, in my mind, it's a technological breakdown of the internet, because we're so interlaced in the internet now that I feel if there was enormous trauma within that, then we would be struggling.
And in your book, the internet crashes in 2038.
38. I suspect it will be a lot sooner than that, but
yes.
I left a bit of distance, yeah.
Just, so that's how you imagined it, starting with images in your mind as you were swimming. But were there any other dystopian books that inspired what you did?
I must admit I haven't actually read a lot of dystopian fiction. I am somebody who does believe that we are in a tiny bit of time where we've had this very luxurious existence, which, if you look at it from any rational point of view, we are in all ways overburdening everything, and it is only a matter of time. I was fascinated by 1984 when I was very young. I thought it was an incredible book, so there obviously are little bits in there.
Yeah, that's not the dystopian work that came to my mind when I was reading your book. I thought I could hear echoes of, as I've told you before, I think Richard Jefferies' After London, maybe William Morris' News from Nowhere. J.G. Ballard in the 60s wrote a book called The Drowned World, which was about London after massive flooding. And I know you like Ian Sinclair a lot as well, a great London writer. There are also, I thought, elements of picaresque. I mean, that your lead character, Hoxton, is trying to discover her origins and also find her son when she works out that she gave birth to a son. A lot of this reminded me of picaresque novels of Henry Fielding, like Tom Jones and Joseph Andrews, where a life on the road is also a life on the road of self-discovery. But it would seem that I was maybe going a bit too far in seeing all of these connections.
I'm not as well read as you, I'm afraid.
I'm not sure about that, but we'll see.
I have read a lot of Dickens and Hardy, and I do have a sort of. I've always had this sort of feeling that we've gone down this developed way too far. I feel we've lost connection with everything that's real, and I do hark back in my mind to probably there wouldn't have been better times, that's for sure, but in some ways there may have been better times where people actually had more connection with nature, with basic survival skills which we've lost. So a lot of the book has those details in it.
Yes, and your character creations are as lively and rich as Dickens is, I think. You have a gift for creating wonderful names like Mr. Hedge Fund and Mrs. Caruso and Jarvis, and even their speech sounds very Dickensian in some ways. It's got echoes of that period, maybe also of medieval English, French, as we said, and you go to the pains of creating a little glossary at the end of the book to explain the origins of some of the slang they use, which reminded me of Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess, because that's exactly what he does.
I mean, I don't actually think the glossary was entirely needed, but it's fun. You know, it's fun to look up certain words, to see if things I've invented or things that I've taken from perhaps Shakespeare, or mess things up into words that have lots of different elements to them. That's mainly why I put it in.
It was your idea, it wasn't the publisher's?
No, not at all. No.
Right. Well, your main character in the novel, Hoxton, is a young-ish woman who, in common with a lot of other people around her, is a finder. That's to say, she scavenges for goods, food, relics of the past, partly for her own consumption and that of her friends, but also to feed the decadent people within the cincture who send her on missions to find anything from a bottle of nail varnish to a piece of IKEA furniture. You have a background, you live in France today, but when you were in London, essentially you were a finder. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yes. Yes, it could have been, what my job was actually called a stylist, a photographic stylist, but yes, you could have been a finder in that way. And when I was beginning to write the book, I didn't actually cotton on to this at all until I'd got about halfway through, and I suddenly realised, yes, it's sort of me. I'm not Hoxton, but there is elements of me in there. It was I think styling made me incredibly cynical, which is why I'm so interested in why we've got so astray from our basic needs and our basic functions. Styling in the 80s and 90s in London and other cities, it was a terribly fluffy thing to do, really, but with a lot of stress as well.
You were basically finding things for
photographic shoots, yeah.
Right.
So you'd get sent out to find crazy things that you knew were going to be virtually impossible to find, often with huge budgets, and the stuff that I found bought or borrowed or hired, often if it was bought stuff, I'd end up actually accumulating because nobody wanted it, so I had a house full of enormous amount of props. And as I went on through the years, I got more and more distressed about this sort of total waste for really nothing at all, for advertising anything from toilets to sinks to food to clothes. It just seemed all terribly sort of unreal. So I think that gave me a really good basis for writing generally. And my first trilogy I wrote was very much based on me and the cynicism I was developing through this job.
What was the name of that trilogy?
It's called Going Out in the Midday Sun. Not saying I didn't benefit from the job, it was a great experience and it kept me alive for a long time, but I think it also gave me a lot of rich, fertile ground for finding these characters and being able to describe characters and conversations and things that I've kept within me which are being useful now.
So another question, you project us immediately into the world of 2072, sorry, but underrunning that is this feeling that you're also writing a critique of contemporary society, partly because the things that the finders find are vestiges of our lives now, and we see how the most unimportant things can become important for the most stupid reasons, and the things that we consider important have fallen by the wayside. Could you tell us a bit about how you view Londonia as a critique of modern life?
Well, again, I think it's going back to the styling thing. It's sort of the slight tongue-in-cheek, wry ridiculing of the society we have, where we put a lot of importance on nothing, really. I mean, there's an extract I might read in a little bit which talks a lot about mobile phones, and mobile phones are incredibly important in our society. I'm not saying I don't use one, but I do think a lot of the trappings that go with it have become completely absurd, and the amount of screen time we spend, the amount of time we don't spend reading, walking, looking at nature. And also it's the IKEA thing is a sort of a bit of a jab at what we buy that we discard and the quality of things that we don't appreciate anymore. I mean, in this room and this house and everything we have is second hand. They come from vide grenier, which is like car boot sale, and sites that sell off stuff. So yeah, the thing about the IKEA cupboard in the story is quite poignant. It's somebody in the sanctuary who wishes to purchase this or find this thing, which is because it's become a fashionable retro item of great importance. And to Hoxton and to her people she associates with in Londondia, it's of absolute no importance, and they can't understand why anybody would want it. And I think a lot of our current society is rather too full of all this stuff, which will end up in landfill, which is sad.
And you mentioned the second-hand artefacts around you in this house. I get the feeling that the way you live here is almost a preparation for the final curtain.
Yeah.
You're interested in permaculture, in self-sufficiency. Are you really planning for that?
I'm not a prepper, but I'm not a pessimist. I would say I'm a total realist. When we recently moved here from a small town down south of France, and I wanted a house where we had the possibility to grow things. It wasn't like a plan, but it just felt like a sort of gut feeling. And I know we're privileged to be able to live like this, and we're not in an apartment with a window box. But for me, it felt very, very important to have a garden where you could grow things, you could chop wood, you could use this wonderful fire we have for our only heating. Those are fundamental things, but I've always had that in me, even when I lived in London, in various crappy flats. I'd always be looking to see if there's any way you could have an open fire, if there's any way you could do some guerrilla gardening on a roundabout or anything like that. So it's always been within me. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Just as an aside, amongst all of the other densely imagined features of life in 2072, food and drink seem to feature very large in your future worldview.
I don't quite know why that is, but all my writing has a lot of featuring of food and drink, especially cups of tea. It's a sort of comfort thing. I love reading books where there's food mentioned because I just find it fascinating what people make to eat, and in this particular book there's a lot of talk of preparing stuff from basics, finding, trapping things, gardening, and then enjoying the food with friends, however basic it is. And that's another thing that I think comes back to styling, because when I first started styling, it was a sort of nouvelle cuisine era, and a lot of the styling I was doing was, well, one photographer in particular, I would go to him with certain props I knew he would use, and then he would send me out to Spitalfields Market, which is very near where this book is featured actually, to buy sacks of onions so he could find the perfect onion and then throw it all away. So that sort of, those wasteful years, again, it sort of feeds into the need to show that we don't actually need that much choice. We just need good quality things, and education in food, I think, is terribly lacking, and I'd love to do something like that in the future as well.
Londondia has a riveting plot that takes us through Hoxton's journey of self-discovery, her meeting, don't want to reveal too much, but her meeting with somebody very close to her. At the same time, there are certain loose ends that are not tied up because there is a sequel, I believe.
There is a sequel.
Which hasn't been published yet, but is with the publishers.
I'm not quite sure where it's got to at the moment, but it may or may not be published, but it's there.
Waiting for somebody to find it.
Yes.
And prior to this book, you mentioned you wrote a trilogy. I think you also wrote children's fiction. Is that right?
Yeah, I wrote a book which was published by Puffin in 2004, called Alfie Beastie Don't Eat That, and that was based on my son's strange period of life where he chose not to eat anything, and it was a sort of frustration which bore that book, which is, I'm still happy with that book. I've written quite a lot of things which I've self-published, short stories, But most of my work tends to be now set in the future, quite fantastical. The one I'm writing at the moment is called The Panto Horse End, which is about the afterlife, and it's so confusing I've got totally lost in it.
Anyone who's interested in that can hear you reading an extract from the beginning on your website, isn't that right?
Or is it there's a YouTube channel,
on YouTube?
YouTube channel called Tales from the Vestry, and
Right.
there is an extract of that on there.
We should mention that Mark, your husband, partner, is a composer, and that when you launched Londonia in London, he wrote a magnificent, almost 1 hour long piece of music. Actually, music does not seem to be the right word, because it's a soundscape. A soundscape, yes, because we hear not only the sounds of musical instruments, but voices and horses and dogs and the clatter of this post-Dickensian London, and it brings the whole place to life. And this we can listen to on the internet as well.
Yes, it's on. I think it's on his Bandcamp. I think.